I was 26 years old when I first understood that wealth could not fill an empty heart, and I learned this truth while kneeling on a dirt floor in a stranger's crumbling cottage, my silk dress stained with mud, my soul awakened for the very first time. They say a duchess should never lower herself to the ground, but I have come to believe that sometimes we must fall to our knees before we can truly rise. My name is Emmeline Ashford, and for 8 years I carried the title of Duchess of Hartwell like a crown made of thorns. I was 18 when my father sold me to the old Duke, a man of 50 winters whose first wife had died childless and whose need for an heir had grown desperate. I remember standing at the altar in my mother's wedding gown, watching this stranger slide a cold ring onto my trembling finger, and thinking that my life had ended before it had truly begun. The Duke was not cruel in the way that some husbands are cruel. He did not strike me or curse at me or lock me away in towers. His cruelty was subtler, more insidious. He simply did not see me. To him, I was a vessel for his legacy, a decorative piece of furniture to grace his dining table, a signature on documents that required a duchess's hand. In 8 years of marriage, I do not believe he ever once looked into my eyes and wondered what thoughts lived behind them. I learned to become invisible in my own home. Hartwell Manor was a magnificent prison of marble and gold, with 47 rooms that echoed with my loneliness and gardens so vast that I could walk for hours without seeing another soul. I filled my days with needlework and reading, with charitable visits that my mother-in-law deemed appropriate, with hosting dinner parties where I smiled until my face ached and said nothing of substance. The servants whispered that I was cold, distant, unapproachable. They did not understand that I had simply retreated so far inside myself that there was nothing left on the surface to touch. I became a ghost, draped in silk and diamonds, haunting the halls of a life that did not belong to me. At night, I would stand at my window and watch the stars, wondering if somewhere out there existed a woman who wore my face, but lived a different story, a story filled with love and laughter and purpose. I envied that imaginary woman with a ferocity that frightened me. The Duke died on a Tuesday in late autumn, slipping away in his sleep as quietly as he had lived. I stood beside his bed as the physician pronounced him gone, and I waited for the grief to come, for the tears that a proper wife should shed for her husband of 8 years. But my eyes remained dry, and my heart remained still, and all I felt was a strange, hollow relief that I immediately hated myself for feeling. The servants looked at me with confusion as I stood dry-eyed beside my husband's body, and I knew they were judging me, finding me wanting. They did not know that I had already mourned my life, mourned it every day for 8 years, and that there was simply no grief left to give. I was a widow now, a woman of considerable fortune and even more considerable freedom, and I had no idea what to do with either. My mother-in-law, Lady Beatrice Ashford, made her opinions known from the very first day of my widowhood. She descended upon Hartwell Manor like a winter storm, all sharp edges and cold pronouncements, and informed me that while I might technically control the estate, I would do well to remember that I was an Ashford only by marriage. She had never approved of me, this formidable woman with her steel-gray eyes and her lips pressed into a permanent line of disapproval. In her view, I was a country baron's daughter who had risen far above her station, a common interloper who had failed in the one duty expected of her by producing no heir. The fact that her son had rarely visited my chambers was a detail she chose to ignore. In her narrative, all failures belonged to me. Lady Beatrice moved into the east wing of Hartwell Manor, claiming it as her right as the Dowager Duchess. She countermanded my orders to the servants, criticized my management of the household, and made it her personal mission to remind me daily of my inadequacy. She had particular ways of doing this that were designed to wound without leaving visible marks. She would smile at me across the breakfast table and ask sweetly if I had considered visiting my family, as surely they must miss me. She would comment on the emptiness of the nursery wing, wondering aloud if perhaps the late Duke had been right to worry about the succession. She would invite guests to dinner without telling me, then apologize profusely for my confusion when I appeared unprepared. Each small cruelty was delivered with such elegant poison that I could never quite protest without seeming petty. I endured 6 months of her presence, of her constant criticism and her pointed remarks about my inadequacy, before I could bear it no longer. The final straw came on a cold morning in February, when she informed me that she had written to several suitable widowers, suggesting that I might be available for remarriage. She had taken it upon herself to advertise me like a piece of unwanted furniture, and when I protested, she merely smiled and said that surely I did not wish to burden the estate forever with my useless presence. Something inside me snapped in that moment. I was not furniture to be sold. I was not a burden to be disposed of. I was a woman, a human being with thoughts and feelings and dreams, and I would not spend another day under this woman's cruel thumb. I announced my intention to visit the northern properties of the Hartwell estate, lands I had never seen that generated much of the duchy's considerable income. Lady Beatrice was scandalized. A duchess traveling alone to the rural north? It was unseemly. It was inappropriate. It was, she declared with barely concealed venom, exactly the sort of foolish behavior one might expect from a woman of my breeding. Her disapproval only strengthened my resolve. I departed Hartwell Manor on a gray morning in early spring, leaving behind the gilded cage that had held me for nearly a decade, not knowing that I was traveling toward a destiny I could never have imagined. The journey north took 4 days by carriage, each mile carrying me further from the life I had known, and closer to something I could not yet name. The landscape changed as we traveled, the manicured estates of the south giving way to wilder country, rolling hills dotted with sheep and ancient forests that seemed to hold secrets in their shadows. I found myself pressing my face to the carriage window like a child, drinking in sights I had only read about in books. The air smelled different here, cleaner and sharper, carrying hints of peat and heather and rain. My maid, a young woman named Sarah, who had volunteered to accompany me despite Lady Beatrice's disapproval, watched my wonder with barely concealed amusement. She had grown up in the north, she told me, and had missed it terribly during her years of service in the south. She spoke of the moors with love in her voice, of the wild beauty of the landscape and the warmth of the people who lived there. For the first time in years, I felt something stir in my chest that might have been hope. The northern estate was called Thornfield House, a respectable manor that had been built by the 3rd Duke of Hartwell as a hunting lodge and had grown over the generations into a proper residence. It was smaller than Hartwell Manor, more intimate, with stone walls that seemed to grow out of the surrounding hillside and windows that looked out over rolling moors and distant mountains. The staff received me with cautious curiosity, clearly unaccustomed to visits from the Duchess, and I found their honest uncertainty refreshing after the polished deception of Hartwell's servants. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Patterson, showed me to my chambers with genuine warmth and asked if there was anything she could do to make my stay comfortable. I asked for a fire, a bath, and silence, and she provided all 3 without question or judgment. For the first week, I did nothing but rest and recover from the journey and the years of accumulated exhaustion that had preceded it. I slept late and ate simple meals and took walks through the grounds, learning the paths and gardens that no one had tended for years. The estate had been neglected in the old Duke's final years, its income collected but its lands left to fend for themselves, and I found a strange kinship with its wild, overgrown beauty. Like me, Thornfield House had been overlooked and abandoned. Like me, it had survived nonetheless. It was on the final day of my 2nd week that fate intervened in the form of a broken wheel. I had decided to visit some of the tenant farms, to see for myself the source of the wealth that had kept me in silk and diamonds for 8 years. The carriage rattled along country roads that were little more than rutted tracks, passing through villages so small they had no names, until we reached a place called Thornwood, a cluster of stone cottages nestled in a valley between two hills. The village was poor but tidy, its inhabitants clearly hard-working people who took pride in their humble homes. I was observing it through the carriage window, thinking about the disconnect between my luxurious life and theirs, when the wheel struck a hidden rock and cracked with a sound like a gunshot. My driver, a capable man named Peters, who had served the Hartwell family for 30 years, informed me with genuine distress that the wheel had cracked beyond repair and that finding a replacement in such a remote location would take at least a day, perhaps 2. The sky above us had turned an ominous gray, and the wind carried the promise of rain. We needed shelter, and quickly. The village inn of Thornwood was small but clean, its whitewashed walls and thatched roof speaking of generations of careful maintenance. The innkeeper, a round woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, seemed genuinely honored to host a duchess. She curtsied so many times that I feared she would topple over, and she showed me to her finest room with such pride that I could not help but be touched. The room was simply furnished but spotlessly maintained, with fresh wildflowers on the windowsill and a fire already laid in the hearth. It was nothing like the grand chambers of Hartwell Manor, and I found that I preferred it. There was honesty in this room, a straightforward hospitality that asked for nothing but gratitude in return. I should have stayed in that room. I should have rested by the fire and waited for my carriage to be repaired, as any proper duchess would do. But something drew me to the window, and through the rain-streaked glass, I saw something that changed everything. At the edge of the village, set apart from the other cottages, stood a small house that had clearly seen better days. Its roof sagged in places, and its garden had gone to seed. And even from a distance, I could see that it was the home of someone who had lost the will to maintain it. But what caught my attention was the light that flickered in its window, a warm glow that seemed at odds with the obvious poverty of the dwelling. And there was something else, something I could not quite identify, that pulled at me like an invisible thread. I felt inexplicably drawn to that light, to that sad little house, as if someone were calling my name from across the distance. Without fully understanding why, I wrapped myself in my traveling cloak and stepped out into the rain. The innkeeper tried to stop me, worried about the weather and my health and the impropriety of a duchess walking alone through a village. But something in my expression must have convinced her that protest was useless, because she stepped aside and let me pass. I walked down the muddy lane, my fine cloak quickly becoming soaked, my silk slippers ruined beyond salvation. The other villagers watched me from their windows, with expressions of confusion and curiosity. This strange fine lady walking through the rain as if in a trance. I did not care what they thought. All I knew was that I had to reach that cottage, had to understand what was drawing me there with such irresistible force. The walk to the cottage took only a few minutes, but by the time I reached its door, my fine cloak was soaked through and my silk slippers were ruined beyond salvation. The rain had plastered my hair to my face and was running in rivulets down my neck, but I barely noticed the discomfort. I stood there in the mud, asking myself what madness had possessed me, when I heard it. A child was crying inside the cottage, not the loud wail of a tantrum or the sharp cry of pain, but the soft, hopeless sobbing of true despair. It was a sound I had never heard before, a sound that spoke of suffering too deep for words, and it pierced my heart like an arrow. And underneath that heartbreaking sound, I heard a man's voice, broken and thick with tears, speaking words that froze me where I stood. "We have no money, child," he was saying. "I am sorry. I am so sorry. I do not know how to save us. I have failed you. I have failed your mother's memory. There is nothing left." The raw anguish in his voice was unbearable. I had grown up in comfort, had lived my entire adult life surrounded by wealth, and I had never truly understood what it meant to have nothing. But standing outside that cottage, listening to a father confess his helplessness to his crying child, I understood for the first time the cruelty of poverty. It was not just the lack of money or food or shelter. It was the destruction of dignity, the murder of hope, the slow suffocation of the spirit under the weight of circumstances beyond control. I should not have opened that door. A lady does not enter a stranger's home uninvited, does not witness private moments of grief and shame. Every rule of propriety, every lesson my mother had taught me, demanded that I turn away and return to the inn. But my hand moved as if of its own accord, and the door creaked open, and I found myself looking at a scene that shattered something inside me and rebuilt it into something new. The room was small and spare, furnished only with the essentials. A worn table held a single candle that provided the flickering light I had seen from the village. A cold fireplace testified to the lack of fuel. The walls were bare except for a single painting, a watercolor of wildflowers that seemed out of place in the otherwise stark surroundings. And in the center of the room, a man knelt on the rough wooden floor, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs, while a little girl with tangled dark hair clung to his neck and cried into his threadbare coat. The man's hands were those of a craftsman or artist, long-fingered and graceful despite being roughened by labor. His hair was dark and unkempt, and when he raised his head at the sound of my entrance, I saw a face that might have been handsome before grief had carved deep lines into it. His jaw was strong, his features well-formed, but it was his eyes that arrested me. They were the color of a stormy sea, gray-green and filled with a pain so profound that it took my breath away. There was intelligence in those eyes, and sensitivity and a deep well of feeling that his circumstances had not managed to destroy. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other, this broken man and this bewildered Duchess. The child continued to cry, her small body trembling with the force of her sobs, and I felt something inside me crack open, like a seed breaking through frozen ground. I had never been a mother. My empty womb had been Lady Beatrice's favorite subject of criticism, a constant reminder of my failure as a wife and a woman. But looking at that crying child, I felt a fierce protectiveness rise up in me that I had never experienced before, a desperate need to comfort and protect that transcended all social boundaries. It was as if my heart had been waiting all along for this moment, storing up love that had nowhere to go until now. I did not think. I did not calculate the impropriety of my actions or consider what society might say. I simply walked across that humble room, lowered myself to my knees in the dirt beside this stranger and his daughter, and reached out my hand to the weeping child. "You are safe," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. "Whatever troubles you face, you are not alone. I promise you, child, you are not alone." The child lifted her face from her father's shoulder and looked at me with eyes that were the same stormy gray-green as her father's, but filled with a child's pure innocence. She was perhaps 5 or 6 years old, thin from hunger, but beautiful in the way that all children are beautiful, with rosy cheeks and a stubborn little chin and hair that must have been lovely when it was properly cared for. She stared at me as if I were a creature from a fairy tale, and perhaps to her I was, this strange woman in a soaked silk gown who had appeared out of the rain like a vision from another world. "Are you an angel?" she asked, and despite everything, I felt a smile touch my lips. "No." "Darling," I said, "I am only a woman who heard you crying and wanted to help." The man had been watching this exchange in stunned silence, but now he seemed to come back to himself. He rose to his feet, gently detaching his daughter from his neck and setting her on the ground beside him, and I saw that he was tall and lean, with the proud bearing of a man who had known better days. His clothes were worn but clean, mended with the careful stitches of someone who took pride in appearance, despite poverty. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, a gesture that only smeared the tears rather than hiding them, and when he spoke, his voice was rough but proud. "I do not know who you are, madam," he said, "but this is not a place for fine ladies. Whatever kindness brought you here, I cannot accept charity. We may be poor, but we are not beggars. I would not have my daughter learn to expect handouts from strangers. His words should have offended me. Perhaps 6 months ago they would have. The old Emmeline, the silent Duchess of Hartwell Manor, would have been shocked by such a direct refusal, would have retreated in confusion and returned to her comfortable world. But I was not that woman anymore. Something had changed in me during the weeks of travel, the days of solitude, the slow awakening of a spirit too long dormant. Looking at this man with his shattered dignity and his fierce protective love for his child, I felt only admiration for his spirit. Here was someone who had lost everything and still held on to his pride, still tried to shield his daughter from the ugliness of their situation. It was more than many wealthy men I knew would have done. "I am Emmeline Ashford," I said, and I watched his eyes widen as recognition dawned. "The Duchess of Hartwell. My carriage has broken down in the village, and I am stranded here until repairs can be made. I was not looking for someone to help. I was merely walking when I heard a child crying, and I could not walk past. My mother taught me that a woman of breeding does not ignore those in need, and whatever title I may hold, I am still my mother's daughter." "Your Grace," the man said, and there was a new stiffness in his posture, a defensive wall going up between us. "Forgive me. I did not know. I would never have spoken so freely to—" "We are not fit company for someone of your station." He trailed off, gesturing at the humble room, the cold fireplace, the child in her patched dress. His shame was palpable, and it made me angry in a way I had not expected. Not angry at him, but angry at a world that could make a father ashamed to be seen by his own child. Angry at a society that valued gold and titles above human dignity. I had lived among the wealthy and titled for 8 years, and I had seen far more shame in their grand houses than I saw in this poor cottage. "What is your name?" I asked, and my voice was gentler than I had intended. "Thomas," he said after a long hesitation. "Thomas Wren. And this is my daughter, Clara." "Clara," I repeated, looking down at the little girl who still stared at me with those wide, wondering eyes. "That is a beautiful name. It means bright and clear, does it not?" "My mamma gave it to me," Clara said, and there was a tremor in her small voice. "But my mamma is in heaven now, with the angels. That is why I asked if you were an angel. I thought maybe she had sent you." Her words pierced my heart like an arrow. This child had lost her mother. This man had lost his wife. They were alone in this cold cottage with nothing but each other, and even that fragile security was threatened by poverty. I understood now the tears, the desperate words I had overheard. Thomas Wren was facing the loss of everything, and he had no idea how to protect his daughter from the storm that was coming. "I am not an angel," I said to Clara, "but I would very much like to be your friend. Would you let me sit with you for a while? I am cold and wet, and I think I have wandered farther from the village than I intended. Perhaps you could tell me about your mamma while I warm myself." It was a lie, of course. The village was only minutes away, and my room at the inn was waiting for me with a warm fire and dry clothes. But something in this cottage held me. Something in this man and his daughter called to a part of me that I had thought long dead. Clara looked up at her father for permission, and after a moment of internal struggle that played across his face, Thomas nodded slowly. "The least I can do is offer you shelter from the rain, Your Grace," he said stiffly. "Though I fear our hospitality is limited, we have no fire and no tea to offer you, only water and whatever dignity remains to us." "That is more than many houses have offered me," I said, and I meant it. Over the next hour, I learned the story of Thomas Wren, and with each detail, my heart broke a little more. He had been a professor of music at a respected academy in London, a man of education and refinement who had married for love and been happy. His wife, Margaret, had been the daughter of a merchant, a woman of modest means but exceptional beauty and kindness. They had met at a concert where Thomas was performing, and he had fallen in love with her the moment she smiled at him from the audience. Their courtship had been proper but passionate, conducted in parlors and parks under the watchful eyes of chaperones, and when they married, Thomas declared it the happiest day of his life. They had lived simply but well, renting a comfortable house near the academy where Thomas could walk to work each morning. Margaret had made their home a haven of warmth and music, filling it with flowers from the market and the sound of her laughter. When Clara was born, their happiness seemed complete. Thomas would play the piano while Margaret held the baby, and he swore that Clara smiled at the music before she could smile at anything else. She was a musical child from the beginning, humming before she could speak, dancing before she could properly walk. But then Margaret had fallen ill. It began with a cough that would not go away, a weakness that crept up so slowly that at first they did not recognize the danger. By the time the doctors understood what they were facing, it was too late. The fever took her in a week, burning through her fragile body while Thomas and Clara watched helplessly. Margaret died with her husband's hand in hers and her daughter's name on her lips. And when she was gone, something in Thomas died with her. He tried to continue. For Clara's sake, he pulled himself out of bed each morning and went to the academy and taught his students. But his heart was not in it anymore. He made mistakes. He forgot lessons. He arrived looking disheveled, smelling of whiskey, his eyes red from sleepless nights. His students complained to their wealthy parents, who complained to the academy's directors, and within 3 months of his wife's death, Thomas Wren was dismissed from his position. They called it a leave of absence, gave him a letter of recommendation that praised his talent while hinting at his unreliability, and sent him away with their best wishes for his recovery. Without the academy, there was no income. Without income, there was no way to pay the rent on their comfortable house. Thomas sold Margaret's jewelry first, then the furniture, then the piano that had been his livelihood and his joy. He took Clara and moved to cheaper lodgings, then cheaper still, until they were living in a single room in a boarding house that smelled of cabbage and despair. He searched for teaching positions, but word of his dismissal had spread through London's musical circles, and no one would hire a professor who had failed so publicly. He took work as a copyist, transcribing scores for pennies a page, ruining his eyes by candlelight while Clara slept in the corner. When even that work dried up, when the last of Margaret's things had been sold and there was nothing left but memories, Thomas remembered the cottage in Thornwood. It had belonged to a distant uncle, a man he had barely known, who had died and left the property to Thomas as his only living relation. It was nothing but a tumble-down house in a village no one had heard of, but it was free, and it was shelter. Thomas gathered his daughter and the few possessions they had left, and they made the long journey north, hoping to find a new beginning in the countryside. But the countryside held no opportunities for a music professor. Thomas tried to find students, but the local families had no money for such luxuries and no appreciation for classical training. He tried to find work as a clerk, but his handwriting was that of an artist, not a bookkeeper, and he was turned away. He tried to farm the small plot of land attached to the cottage, but he knew nothing of farming, and his first crop failed before it barely began. Month by month, the little money he had saved dwindled away. He sold the furniture he had brought from London. He sold his books, his music, his last good coat. And now there was nothing left. The landlord had raised the rents on all the properties in the area, and Thomas could not pay. In a fortnight, he and Clara would be cast out onto the roads with nothing but the clothes on their backs. As he told his story, his eyes never left his daughter, who had curled up on a threadbare cushion by the empty fireplace and fallen asleep with the exhaustion of a child who had cried too long. Her face was peaceful in sleep, innocent of the disaster looming over her, and there was such tenderness in Thomas's gaze that I felt my throat tighten with emotion. This was not a man who had squandered his fortune on gambling or drink. This was not a man who had failed through laziness or vice. This was a man who had loved his wife so deeply that her death had nearly destroyed him, and who was now fighting with everything he had to keep his daughter safe. That he was losing that fight was not a failure of character, but a cruelty of circumstance. the kind of injustice that made me question everything I had been taught about the natural order of society. When he finished speaking, silence fell between us. The rain had slowed to a gentle patter against the window, and the candle had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the walls. I looked at this man, this proud, broken, beautiful man, and I knew what I wanted to say. But I also knew that Thomas Wren would refuse any offer that smelled of charity. His pride was all he had left, the last possession he had not been forced to sell, and I would not ask him to surrender it. I had to be clever, had to find a way to help that would preserve his dignity while giving Clara the security she deserved. "Mr. Wren," I said finally, "I find myself in an unusual position. I am a widow with a great deal of money and no purpose for it. I own a vast estate that I barely understand, properties that generate income I never see, tenants whose names I do not know. For 8 years, I was merely a decoration in my husband's house, a silent ornament in silk and diamonds. I have no accomplishments to speak of. I cannot paint or draw. I have no talent for languages. And despite 8 years of living in the finest house in the county, I never learned to play the piano. My husband considered it a frivolous pursuit and forbade me to waste time on it." Thomas looked at me with confusion, clearly not understanding where my words were leading. His brow furrowed in that way that I would come to know so well, the expression he wore when he was trying to solve a puzzle. "You were a professor of music," I continued, and my heart was beating faster now, nervous in a way I had not felt since my wedding day. "I am a woman who wishes to learn. It seems to me that we might come to an arrangement that would benefit us both. I would pay you a fair salary to serve as my instructor, and in return, you would give me lessons several times a week at my northern estate. There is a cottage on the grounds that stands empty, far finer than this one, with a garden for Clara to play in and a stable nearby with ponies. You could live there rent-free as part of your compensation. It is the sort of arrangement any great house might make with a music teacher, nothing more and nothing less." I watched his face as I spoke, watched the play of emotions that crossed his features. Hope warred with suspicion, pride battled with desperation, and underneath it all, I saw the flicker of a father's love, calculating the odds for his daughter's sake. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. I could see him fighting against the offer, against the temptation to accept what must have seemed like miraculous salvation. I held my breath, waiting. "Your Grace," he said slowly, "that is an extraordinarily generous offer. More generous than I deserve. Certainly more generous than I have any right to expect. But I must ask you plainly, for my pride will not allow otherwise. Is this charity disguised as employment? Are you offering me work because you pity me? Because you stumbled upon my shame and feel obligated to repair it?" I looked him directly in the eyes, and I answered with complete honesty. "It is an offer of employment," I said. "I genuinely wish to learn the piano. I have wished it for years, but was never permitted the indulgence. Now I am a widow with my own fortune, and no one to tell me what I may or may not do. I need an instructor, and you need a position. That the arrangement happens to come with accommodations suitable for a man with a young daughter is simply practical. Would you require your butler to find his own housing, your stable master to sleep in the streets? The cottage is part of the compensation, nothing more. If it makes you feel better, you may consider it a necessity of the position. I cannot have my piano teacher living 20 miles away. The lessons would be impossible to schedule. It was not entirely true and not entirely false. I did wish to learn the piano, had wished it for years, but had never been permitted the indulgence by a husband who considered artistic pursuits a waste of time and money. And the cottage did stand empty, a charming little house that had once belonged to the estate's head gardener before he retired to live with his daughter in the South. But I would be lying if I claimed that my primary motivation was musical education. Looking at Clara sleeping by that cold fireplace, her thin cheeks and her patched dress and her innocent trust that her father would somehow save them, I knew that I would have offered Thomas Wren anything to get him to accept. The piano lessons were simply the bridge that would allow him to cross without sacrificing his self-respect. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and I could see the struggle in his eyes. Pride pulled him one way, love pulled him another. He looked at his sleeping daughter, at her thin face and her small hands curled under her chin, and something in his expression shifted. The pride was still there, but it was tempered now by something stronger: love. A father's determination to give his child a better life, whatever the cost to his own pride. "When would you wish to begin?" he asked, and his voice was rough with emotion. I felt a smile spread across my face, genuine and warm in a way that I had almost forgotten was possible. "As soon as you are settled," I said. "I will send a carriage for you and Clara within the week. Pack whatever you wish to bring, and do not worry about the rest. The cottage is furnished, and anything else you need can be provided." I rose to my feet, preparing to return to the village before the light failed entirely. My cloak was still wet, and my slippers were ruined, but I felt warmer than I had in years. Thomas rose with me, and for a moment we stood facing each other in that humble room. He was taller than I had realized, and even in his threadbare coat, there was a dignity about him that no amount of poverty could erase. He extended his hand to me, and I took it, feeling the warmth of his palm against mine, the calluses of honest work, the slight tremor of a man who had been given hope when he had expected only despair. "Thank you, Your Grace," he said simply. "I do not have the words to express what this means. For Clara's sake, if not my own, I am grateful beyond measure." "Then do not try," I said. "Simply teach me to play, and we will call it even. And Mr. Wren," I added, pausing at the door, "when we are in lessons, you must not call me Your Grace. It makes me feel like I am back at Hartwell Manor, surrounded by servants who never looked me in the eye. Call me Mrs. Ashford, or simply Madam if you prefer, but not Your Grace. I have had quite enough of that title to last a lifetime." He nodded, a small smile touching his lips for the first time since I had entered his cottage. "As you wish," he said. "Madam." I left the cottage as the last light of day was fading, my ruined slippers squelching in the mud, my heart lighter than it had been in years. The rain had stopped, and the clouds were breaking apart to reveal patches of evening sky, pink and gold and purple like a painting by an old master. I did not know, as I walked back to the village, that I had just taken the first step on a journey that would change everything. I did not know that the man I left behind would become the center of my world, or that his daughter would teach me the meaning of motherhood. All I knew was that for the first time since my wedding day, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The week that followed was a flurry of activity. I sent word to Hartwell Manor that I would be extending my stay in the north indefinitely, and I set about preparing the gardener's cottage for its new occupants. The house had been empty for 2 years, but it was solidly built, with 4 rooms and a kitchen, and a small stable that could accommodate a pony. I hired local women to clean and air out the rooms, to stock the pantry with provisions, to fill vases with fresh flowers and lay new linens on the beds. I sent to the nearest town for toys and books suitable for a child of Clara's age, and I had the old piano from the manor's music room tuned and moved to the cottage's main room. I told myself that I was simply being practical, that a music teacher needed a piano to teach, but I knew in my heart that I was doing far more than practicality required. I was building a home for them, a safe haven where Clara could grow and Thomas could heal, and neither of them would ever have to fear poverty again. I did not tell anyone who would be living in the cottage, only that I was expecting a new employee and his daughter. The servants of Thornfield House accepted this without question, accustomed to the whims of aristocracy. But I could see curiosity in their eyes, could hear whispers in the hallways when they thought I was not listening. A music teacher? For the Duchess who had never shown the slightest interest in music? And a widower with a child, no less? It was strange, certainly, and the staff did not know what to make of it. I did not care. Let them whisper. Let them wonder. For the first time in my life, I was doing something because I wanted to, not because society expected it, and the freedom was intoxicating. Thomas and Clara arrived on a bright morning when the world was washed clean by rain, and the sky stretched blue and endless above the hills. I watched from the window of Thornfield House as the carriage I had sent pulled up the long drive. Thomas emerged first, looking around at his new surroundings with an expression of stunned disbelief. He was dressed better than when I had last seen him, in clothes that were old but clean and well-maintained, and I suspected he had used his last coins to present himself as respectably as possible. Even now, even accepting what must have felt like charity despite my careful framing, he refused to appear anything less than dignified. His pride touched me, and I admired him for it. Then he turned and lifted Clara from the carriage, and when I saw her face, I felt my heart squeeze painfully in my chest. She was wearing a dress I did not recognize, simple but new, with a blue ribbon in her hair that matched the color of the sky. Thomas had prepared her for this new life as best he could, had given her what little he had to give, and the love evident in that gesture moved me more than all the grand declarations of all the lords I had ever known. Here was a man who would sell his last possession to make his daughter smile, who would swallow his pride and accept help from a stranger if it meant keeping his child safe. I had never known a man like that. I had not known such men existed. I descended to meet them, and Clara ran to me with the unhesitant trust of childhood, wrapping her small arms around my skirts and looking up at me with those extraordinary gray-green eyes. "I knew you would come back," she said, her voice bright with joy. "Papa said you might change your mind, that fine ladies often make promises they do not keep. But I knew you would not. I told him you were different." I bent down to her level, taking her small hands in mine. "I never break my promises," I said. "And I have a surprise for you. There is a cottage near here with a garden full of flowers, and if you look very carefully, you might find a family of rabbits living under the hedge. Would you like to see it?" Clara's face lit up with such joy that I felt my heart turn over in my chest. She looked back at her father with such excitement that I could not help but laugh. Thomas was watching us with an expression I could not quite read, something between gratitude and wariness, as if he still could not quite believe that this was real. I understood that feeling. I could hardly believe it myself. The cottage exceeded even my hopes. In the week since I had last seen it, the local women had transformed it into a cozy haven, with flowers on every surface and a fire crackling cheerfully in the hearth. Clara explored every room with squeals of delight, discovering the toys I had ordered from the nearby town, the picture books with colorful illustrations, the watercolor set with its array of bright paints, the small piano that stood in the corner of the main room like a promise of music to come. Thomas moved through the cottage more slowly, touching the curtains and the furniture and the well-stocked pantry as if afraid they would disappear. When he turned to face me, there were tears in his eyes that he did not try to hide. "Your Grace," he began, but I held up my hand. "Emmeline," I said, "when we are alone, when there are no servants or society to observe, you must call me Emmeline. I told you I could not bear to hear your Grace from a man who is to be my teacher. It feels ridiculous. It makes me feel like my mother-in-law, and I assure you that is not a compliment." He hesitated, the class barrier rising between us like a wall, and I could see him struggling with propriety. But something in my expression must have convinced him, because after a moment, he nodded. "Emmeline," he said, and my name sounded different on his lips, softer and more musical than I had ever heard it. "I do not know how to thank you for this, for everything you have done for Clara, for me. I do not have words sufficient for such gratitude. Teach me to play," I said again, and this time I smiled. "That will be thanks enough. I have wanted to learn for years, and now I finally have the opportunity. Do not make me wait any longer, Mr. Wren. I am not a patient woman." "Then let us begin," he said, and there was a new light in his eyes. a spark of the enthusiasm that must have made him a brilliant professor before grief had dimmed it. But I must warn you, madam. I mean Emmeline. I am not an easy teacher. I expect dedication and practice, and a willingness to fail before you succeed. Music is not learned in a day or a month or even a year. It is a lifetime's journey. I have nothing but time, I said. And I am more stubborn than you know. Our lessons began the following day, and they were nothing like I had expected. I had imagined something formal and stiff, hours of scales and exercises and stern corrections. But Thomas Wren was a born teacher, patient and gentle, and endlessly creative. He did not begin with notes or theory, but with stories, with history, with the lives of the great composers and the emotions that had driven their music. He sat beside me at the piano, so close that I could smell the clean scent of soap and wool, and he told me about Bach and Beethoven and Mozart as if they were old friends. He described the circumstances of their lives, the tragedies and triumphs that had shaped their work, the feelings they had poured into their compositions. Music, he explained, was not just a technical skill to be mastered. It was a language of the heart, a way of expressing emotions that words could never capture. He played for me, his long fingers dancing across the keys with a skill that took my breath away. And as he played, he explained what the music meant, what the composer had been feeling, what message was hidden in the notes. I had never thought of music as a language before, but Thomas showed me that it was, a language of the heart that could say things that words never could. When he played a melancholy piece, I felt my own buried sorrows rise to the surface. When he played something joyful, I found myself smiling without knowing why. He was not just teaching me to play the piano, he was teaching me to feel again, to connect with emotions I had suppressed for years. Clara sat in on our lessons more often than not, curled up on a cushion by the window with her picture books or her watercolors. She was a quiet child by nature, content to occupy herself for hours, but she always looked up when her father played something particularly beautiful, and sometimes she would hum along in a high, clear voice that reminded me of birdsong. She had inherited her father's musical gift, Thomas told me, and her mother's sweet temperament. She was the best of both of them combined, and watching her was like watching a flower bloom in slow motion. I found myself watching her as often as I watched the piano, captivated by her small concentration, by the way she bit her lip when she was focused, by the rare and brilliant smile that transformed her face when she was happy. I had never spent time with children before, had never had the opportunity. Lady Beatrice had considered children a nuisance to be kept in nurseries and schoolrooms, seen briefly at appointed times and otherwise forgotten. But Clara was impossible to forget. She followed me around the gardens, chattering about the flowers and the butterflies and the rabbit family she had discovered under the hedge. She showed me her watercolors, explaining each painting with the seriousness of an artist presenting her masterwork. She asked me questions about my life, my home, my family, with the boundless curiosity of childhood, and I found myself answering honestly, sharing things I had never told anyone. Weeks passed, and I made progress at the piano that surprised us both. I was not a natural musician, my fingers too stiff from years of needlework and too unaccustomed to the stretch of an octave. But I was determined, and Thomas was patient, and slowly, painfully, I began to coax melodies from the keys. The first time I played a complete piece without errors, a simple folk song that Thomas had arranged for beginners, I felt a surge of triumph that rivaled any I had known in the grand ballrooms of London. Thomas applauded with genuine enthusiasm, and Clara jumped up from her cushion to hug me. And I realized with a start that I was happier in this modest music room than I had ever been in all the gilded salons of Hartwell Manor. But with the happiness came a growing awareness of danger. Thomas Wren was not just my teacher. He was becoming my friend, my confidant, the person I most wanted to see each day. I found myself rising early so that I might take my breakfast before our lessons, giving me an excuse to spend more time at the cottage. I found excuses to bring gifts for Clara, books and toys and ribbons for her hair, telling myself it was merely the kindness one might show any child. I found myself thinking of Thomas when I was alone, remembering the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the low music of his voice, the surprising strength of his hands on the keys. I told myself that these feelings were nothing, merely the natural affection of a student for her teacher, the warmth of friendship and gratitude. But I knew, in the secret chambers of my heart, that I was lying. Thomas, I began to realize, was struggling with something similar. I caught him watching me when he thought I was not looking, his gray-green eyes soft with an emotion he quickly hid. He took care never to touch me beyond what was necessary for instruction, maintaining a careful distance even when correcting my hand position at the piano, and I understood that he was drawing boundaries between us that he did not trust himself to maintain. He was a gentleman, despite his reduced circumstances, and I was a duchess, despite my unhappy marriage. The gulf between us was vast, and we both knew that crossing it would bring disaster upon us both. Summer turned to autumn, and autumn to early winter, and still we maintained our careful pretense. We met for lessons 3 times a week, then 4, then every day. We talked for hours about music and books and philosophy and life. We walked together through the gardens of Thornfield House, Clara running ahead of us to chase butterflies or collect autumn leaves. To anyone watching, we were nothing more than a duchess and her music teacher, maintaining a proper professional relationship. But beneath the surface, something was building, something neither of us dared to name. It was Lady Beatrice who forced the issue into the open. My mother-in-law had spies everywhere, servants and society matrons who were only too happy to report on the doings of the peculiar young widow who had fled to the north. Word of my unusual arrangement with Thomas had reached her within weeks of its beginning, and she had watched and waited with the patience of a spider, gathering information and building her case. She arrived at Thornfield House on a cold morning in early December, her carriage rolling up the drive like a harbinger of doom. I received her in the formal parlor, my heart pounding with dread, and when she swept in with her steel-gray eyes and her lips pressed thin with disapproval, I knew that the fragile peace I had built was about to be shattered. "Well, Emmeline," she said, and her voice was ice, "I have heard the most extraordinary rumors. A piano teacher, a widower with a child, living in a cottage on your estate, receiving private lessons daily. Tell me that this is some mistake, some exaggeration of idle gossip. Tell me that you have not made such a complete fool of yourself." I lifted my chin and met her gaze squarely, refusing to show the fear that churned in my stomach. "It is no mistake," I said. "Thomas Wren is an excellent teacher, and I am learning the piano. There is nothing improper about the arrangement." "Nothing improper," she repeated, and her laugh was sharp and cruel. "A young widow and a handsome widower, alone together for hours each day, and you tell me there is nothing improper? You are either lying or a fool, Emmeline. Perhaps both. Do you think society does not see through your little charade? Do you think the whispers have not already begun?" "I am beyond caring what society thinks," I said, and I was surprised to find that it was true. I spent 8 years caring about society's opinion, living my life according to its rules, and it brought me nothing but misery. I am done with that now. I will live as I choose, and society can say what it likes. Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "Pretty words," she said, "but you forget that society's judgment carries consequences. You may not care what people say about you, but what about your precious piano teacher? What about his daughter? Are you prepared to drag them down with you into scandal and ruin?" The question struck me like a blow. I had not thought about that, had been so focused on my own rebellion that I had not considered the cost to Thomas and Clara. They were vulnerable in a way that I was not. I had wealth and title to shield me from the worst of society's cruelty. They had nothing. "I have not come to argue with you," Lady Beatrice continued, settling into a chair as if she owned the house. "I have come to give you a warning. out of what remains of my affection for my son's memory. The tongue is already whispering about you. The peculiar widow who fled to the north, the Duchess who dines with servants and takes lessons from paupers. You are becoming a laughingstock, Emmeline. Your reputation, such as it is, hangs by a thread. If you do not end this association immediately, I will be forced to take action to protect the Ashford name. What action? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Lady Beatrice smiled, and there was no warmth in it. Thomas Wren is an unfit father, she said, her voice calm and matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. A man who lost his position due to negligence, who has been living in poverty, who cannot provide for his own child. It would be easy enough to have the girl removed from his care. I have friends in the church, in the courts, men who owe me favors and would be happy to repay them. One word from me, and Clara Wren will be taken to an orphanage where she belongs, where she will be raised properly, away from her father's unfortunate influence. The blood drained from my face. I thought of Clara, of her sweet smile and her trusting eyes, of the way she hugged her father good night, and the way she hummed when she painted. I thought of her in an orphanage, alone and frightened, torn from the only parent she had left. The image was so horrifying that for a moment I could not speak, could not breathe. You would not dare, I whispered. Try me, Lady Beatrice said. End this farce, Emmeline. Send the music teacher away. Return to Hartwell Manor and conduct yourself as a proper Duchess should. Find a suitable second husband and produce an heir for the Ashford name. Or I promise you, the child will pay the price for your foolishness. And do not think you can protect her. My reach is longer than you know, and my patience is at an end. She swept out as imperiously as she had arrived, leaving me standing alone in the parlor, my world crumbling around me. I wanted to believe she was bluffing, that even she would not stoop to harming an innocent child. But I knew Lady Beatrice. I had watched her destroy rivals with a whisper, had seen her engineer the downfall of women who crossed her. She had ruined reputations, ended engagements, driven families from society with nothing more than carefully placed rumors and well-timed revelations. She would do exactly as she threatened, and there was no one in the world with the power to stop her. I did not go to my lesson that day. I could not face Thomas, could not look into his eyes and pretend that everything was fine. Instead, I walked through the gardens of Thornfield House until dusk fell, trying to find a path through the impossible maze that Lady Beatrice had created. If I sent Thomas away, I would lose everything that had begun to make my life worth living. The lessons, the laughter, the sense of purpose and belonging that I had found in their company would all be gone. But if I did not, Clara would suffer. An innocent child would be torn from her father and thrown into an institution because of my selfish desire for happiness. It was an impossible choice, and the weight of it crushed me. It was Thomas who found me, standing by the garden fountain as the last light faded from the sky. The fountain had been dry for years, its stone basin filled with fallen leaves, and I had been staring at it without seeing, lost in my own desperate thoughts. He approached slowly, his footsteps soft on the gravel path, and when I turned to face him, I saw concern written plainly on his features. "Clara told me your mother-in-law came today," he said quietly. "She saw the carriage from the cottage window and recognized the crest. Are you all right? You look as if you have seen a ghost." I wanted to lie to him, to tell him that everything was fine, that Lady Beatrice's visit had been nothing more than a routine family call. But looking into his gray-green eyes, those eyes that had become so dear to me, I found that I could not. The whole story spilled out of me. Lady Beatrice's threats and her ultimatum, the danger to Clara, the impossible choice I faced. Thomas listened in silence, his face growing darker with each word, and when I finished, the fury in his eyes frightened me. "She cannot do this," he said, and his voice was rough with anger. "Clara is my daughter, my flesh and blood. No one has the right to take her from me, least of all a bitter old woman seeking revenge for imagined slights. I will fight her in the courts. I will take Clara and disappear. I will not let that woman touch my child. She is a powerful woman with powerful friends, I said, my voice dull with despair. And I am a widow with a dubious reputation, living alone in the north with a man who is not my husband. In the eyes of society, she has every right to question the arrangement. And you, Thomas, forgive me, but you have no power at all. No money, no connections, no standing. If she chooses to pursue this, you cannot stop her. Then I will leave, Thomas said, and the words cost him visibly. I could see the pain in his eyes, the agony of the decision he was making. I will take Clara and go somewhere she cannot find us. I will change our names, start over in another country if I must. I will not let you be destroyed because of me, Emmeline. I will not let Clara be used as a pawn in that woman's cruel game. No, I said, and the force of the words surprised us both. I reached out and took his hands, propriety forgotten, feeling the warmth of his palms against mine. You will not run. You will not sacrifice your daughter's future because of that woman's cruelty. You will not spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, waiting for her to find you. There must be another way. What way? He asked, and his voice broke on the question. Emmeline, I am nobody. A failed professor, a penniless widower. I have nothing to fight her with, nothing to protect Clara, nothing to offer you but my. He stopped himself, but I knew what word had been on his lips. Nothing to offer you but my love. We stood there in the gathering darkness, hands clasped, and the truth hung between us like a veil waiting to be lifted. I thought of Lady Beatrice and her threats. I thought of society and its judgment. I thought of everything I would lose if I spoke the words trembling on my tongue. And then I thought of Clara's smile, and Thomas's eyes, and the music that had filled my life since the day I walked into that crumbling cottage. Stay, I whispered, stay, and let me fight for you. Let me fight for us. Thomas's hands tightened on mine, and I saw the moment when his resistance crumbled. He leaned forward, slowly, giving me time to pull away, and when I did not, he pressed his lips to mine in a kiss so gentle it felt like a prayer. It was the first kiss of my life that had meant anything, the first touch of love I had ever known, and I melted into it like snow into spring water. I love you, he breathed against my mouth. God help me, Emmeline. I have loved you from the moment you knelt in the dirt beside my daughter and told her she was not alone. I have tried to fight it, tried to remember my place, tried to be grateful for what you have given us without wanting more. But I cannot fight anymore. I love you, and whatever comes of it, I will not deny it again. And I love you, I said, and the words felt like freedom. I love you, and I love Clara, and I will not let that woman destroy what we have built. We will find a way, Thomas. I do not know how yet, but we will find a way. The weeks that followed were a strange twilight of joy and fear. Thomas and I could not be open about our feelings, not while Lady Beatrice's threat hung over us. But we stole moments together whenever we could, glances across the music room, whispered conversations after Clara had gone to bed, a kiss in the garden under cover of darkness, trembling with forbidden sweetness. We both knew that we were playing a dangerous game, that discovery would mean ruin. But we could not stop. The love between us was a force of nature, undeniable and unstoppable, and we surrendered to it even as we feared its consequences. Clara, with the perception of children, seemed to sense the change between us. She began calling me Mama Emmeline, a title that made my heart swell with painful joy. She drew pictures of the three of us together, father and daughter and the Duchess who had become their family, standing in front of a house with smoke curling from the chimney and flowers in the garden. She asked me if I would stay with them always, and I promised her that I would try, that I would do everything in my power to keep us together. Meanwhile, I began to prepare for battle. I wrote letters to solicitors in London, inquiring about the laws governing child custody and the rights of fathers. I contacted old acquaintances from my days at Hartwell Manor, women who had seemed sympathetic and might be persuaded to speak on Thomas's behalf. I began to investigate Lady Beatrice herself, searching for any weakness, any scandal, any leverage I might use against her. It felt wrong, this deliberate gathering of weapons against a woman who was technically my family. But she had threatened my family now, the family I had chosen, and I would do whatever was necessary to protect them. The blow fell on a gray morning in early January, when the new year had barely begun and the world was still wrapped in winter's grip. A carriage arrived at the cottage bearing 2 men in dark coats and a woman with a face like sour milk. Thomas was at the manor house for our lesson, and Clara was alone with the housekeeper, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had become fond of the little girl. The men presented documents bearing official seals and the authority of the church. They spoke of Thomas's failure to provide, of the unsuitability of his living arrangements, of concerns raised by prominent families about the welfare of the child. And before Mrs. Patterson could even send word to the manor, before Thomas could be summoned or I could intervene, they took Clara from the cottage. I heard the commotion from the music room, where Thomas and I were working through a difficult passage. We both looked up at the sound of running feet, and a moment later, one of the maids burst through the door, her face white with shock. "Your Grace," she gasped. "The child. They have taken the child." We ran, both of us, abandoning propriety and dignity in our desperation to reach the cottage. But we were too late. The carriage was already pulling away down the drive, and through the window I could see Clara's face, pale and terrified, her small hands pressed against the glass. I will never forget the sound of her screaming. It echoes in my nightmares still, that high, desperate wail of a child being torn from everything she loved. "Papa," she cried, her voice carrying across the cold winter air. "Papa, do not let them take me. Mama Emmeline, please, please help me." I ran after the carriage as it pulled away, but I could not catch it. My skirts tangled around my legs, my breath came in ragged gasps, and still the carriage pulled further and further ahead. I stumbled and fell in the gravel of the drive, tearing my dress and scraping my hands, and still I tried to rise, to follow, to do something, but it was hopeless. The carriage disappeared around the bend, taking Clara with it, and I was left kneeling in the cold, sobbing with rage and grief and helplessness. Thomas reached me a moment later, his face gray with shock. He helped me to my feet, his hands trembling, and when I looked into his eyes, I saw something that frightened me more than anything else that morning. I saw a man whose heart was breaking, whose last reason for hope was being carried away in a stranger's carriage. I saw a man who might not survive another loss. "Where have they taken her?" I demanded of the servants who had gathered around us. "Did anyone see? Did anyone hear where they were going?" "The orphanage at Blackmore," someone said. "A young groom who had been in the stable and had seen the whole thing." I heard them say it. 20 miles south on the moor road. They said she would be well cared for there. Blackmore. I had heard of the place. It had a reputation in the county as a strict institution, a place where unwanted children were sent to be forgotten. The thought of Clara there, alone and afraid, surrounded by strangers who did not love her, was more than I could bear. I did not waste another moment. I strode into the manor house and began issuing orders with an authority I had never used before. "Prepare my carriage," I said, "the fastest horses we have. Send word to my solicitor in London that I require his presence immediately. Contact every member of the county council who owes the Hartwell estate a favor, and find out everything you can about the orphanage at Blackmore, its administrators, its patrons, its vulnerabilities. I want to know who runs that place and what they fear." The servants scattered to obey, their faces reflecting a mix of surprise and admiration. They had never seen me like this, had never known that the quiet, passive Duchess harbored such steel. But I was a different woman now. 8 years of silence had ended. Clara needed me, and I would not fail her. Thomas tried to stop me, tried to tell me that it was hopeless, that Lady Beatrice had won. His voice was dull, his eyes empty, and I could see that he was already surrendering to despair. But I would not let him. I could not. I did not kneel in the dirt that day to watch your daughter be taken to an orphanage, I told him, taking his face in my hands and forcing him to meet my eyes. I did not fall in love with you only to let that woman destroy our family. Clara needs us, Thomas. She needs her father, and she needs me, and we will not fail her. Do you hear me? We will not fail her. Something in my words reached him, cut through the fog of his grief, and ignited a spark of the same fierce determination I felt. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched, and slowly, I saw the fight return to his eyes. Then let us fight, he said, together. The battle that followed was the hardest of my life, but I would not have traded it for anything. For the first time, I had a purpose that mattered, a cause worth fighting for. I threw myself into the campaign to rescue Clara with an energy and focus I had not known I possessed. I slept little, ate less, and spent every waking moment either gathering evidence or planning strategy. Thomas worked alongside me, his grief transformed into determination, his love for his daughter driving him forward when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm us both. Lady Beatrice had prepared her ground well. She had spent months spreading rumors of my moral corruption and Thomas's unfitness throughout the county. She had cultivated allies in the church and the courts, men who owed her favors or feared her displeasure. She had ensured that the officials who took Clara were beyond reproach, their documents in perfect order, their authority unquestionable. To challenge her would be to challenge the entire apparatus of respectable society, and most people in my position would have surrendered in the face of such overwhelming odds. But Lady Beatrice had underestimated me. For 8 years, I had been invisible, silent, a decorative nothing in the halls of power. But I had not been idle during those years. I had watched, I had listened, I had learned. I knew the secrets of the great families, the scandals that lurked behind their polished facades, the debts and indiscretions that they worked so hard to hide. I had never imagined using this knowledge as a weapon. But for Clara, I would do anything. I discovered that Lady Beatrice had debts of her own, secret gambling losses that she had hidden from society for years. She had lost thousands at the card tables of London's most exclusive clubs, and she had been paying her creditors with money embezzled from the Hartwell estate, money that had been intended for the tenants and the maintenance of the properties. I discovered that the magistrate who had authorized Clara's removal was in her pocket, bribed with promises of advancement and threats of exposure. I discovered that the orphanage at Blackmore was a hellhole of neglect and cruelty, its matron more interested in the fees she collected than the children in her care. Children died there, I learned, from illness and neglect and simple despair, and no one ever asked questions because no one cared about orphans. I gathered my evidence carefully, documenting each discovery, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss. I contacted allies of my own, women of good standing who had secretly despised Lady Beatrice for years and were only too happy to support her downfall. I found a solicitor who was both brilliant and fearless, a man named Hawkins who had made his reputation defending the powerless against the powerful. He reviewed my evidence with growing excitement and assured me that we had more than enough to destroy Lady Beatrice if I had the courage to use it. I had the courage. For Clara, I had courage enough for anything. The confrontation took place at a society gathering at Lord Ashworth's estate, where the cream of Northern society had gathered for the winter ball. It was the largest and most prestigious event of the season, and everyone who was anyone would be in attendance, including Lady Beatrice, who had come to gloat over her victory and solidify her position as the power behind the Ashford name. I entered on Thomas's arm, wearing my finest gown and my coldest smile. The room fell silent as we approached, whispers spreading like wildfire through the assembled guests. They all knew about the scandal, about the Duchess and her music teacher, about the child who had been taken away for her own protection. They expected to see me humiliated, broken, come to beg Lady Beatrice's forgiveness. What they saw instead was a woman transformed, a woman who walked with her head held high and her eyes burning with righteous fury. "Lady Beatrice," I said, and my voice carried to every corner of the ballroom. "I believe we have unfinished business." The scene that followed would be talked about for years. I laid out my evidence before the assembled guests, every sordid detail of Lady Beatrice's schemes and manipulations. The gambling debts, the embezzlement, the bribery of officials, the cruel vendetta against an innocent child for no reason other than spite and jealousy. I had witnesses who testified to her crimes. I had documents that proved her guilt beyond question. And I had the letter she had written to the matron of Blackmore, explicitly ordering that Clara be separated from any family that might claim her, that she be made to suffer as a warning to those who defied Lady Beatrice Ashford. By the time I finished, Lady Beatrice's face had gone from red to white to gray. The other guests stared at her with a mix of horror and fascination, the same look they might have given a creature revealed to be monstrous beneath its elegant disguise. She tried to speak, to defend herself, to deny the accusations, but her voice failed her. For the first time in her life, she had no words, no clever response, no way to manipulate her way out of the trap that had closed around her. And when I demanded that Clara be returned to her father immediately, there was not a voice raised in objection. Lord Ashworth, to his credit, took charge of the situation. He was a good man, despite his position, and he had long suspected that Lady Beatrice was not what she appeared. He dispatched men to Blackmore that very night, with orders to retrieve Clara and bring her home safely. And he made it clear to everyone present that Lady Beatrice was no longer welcome in respectable society, that anyone who associated with her would share in her disgrace. By dawn, Clara was back in her father's arms. She was thinner than when she had been taken, and there were shadows under her eyes that broke my heart. The 2 weeks she had spent at Blackmore had changed her, had stolen some of the innocent joy that had once defined her. But when she saw me, her face lit up with a joy that washed away all the pain of the weeks before. "Mama Emmeline," she cried, throwing her arms around my neck, "I knew you would come. I told them you would come for me, that you would not forget me, and you did not. You came." I held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her small heart beating against my chest. "Never," I whispered. "I will never forget you, Clara. I will never let anyone take you away again. You are my daughter now, in my heart, if not in law, and I will protect you until my last breath." Lady Beatrice left the north the following day, her reputation in tatters, her power broken. She retreated to a distant estate in the south, where she lived out her remaining years in bitter obscurity. I heard that she died alone, attended only by servants who despised her, and I could not bring myself to feel sorry for her. She had tried to destroy a child to feed her own petty vengeance, and she had received the justice she deserved. In the aftermath of the scandal, Thomas and I could no longer hide our feelings from the world. But to my surprise, the world proved more forgiving than I had expected. Perhaps it was the romance of our story, the Duchess who had risked everything for love. Perhaps it was sympathy for Clara, the innocent child caught in the middle of adult cruelty. Perhaps it was simply that society loves a good drama, and our drama had been very good indeed. Whatever the reason, when Thomas Wren asked for my hand in marriage, the congratulations far outnumbered the condemnations. We were married in the spring, in the small chapel of Thornwood, where Thomas and Margaret had once exchanged their own vows. I wore a simple gown of ivory silk, and Clara walked before me strewing petals from the garden she had come to love. Thomas waited at the altar with tears in his eyes, and when I placed my hand in his, I felt the last chains of my old life fall away. "I, Emmeline, take thee, Thomas," I said, and my voice was steady and strong. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do us part. I was not merely gaining a husband that day, I was gaining a daughter. When the ceremony was complete and we emerged into the sunlight as a family, Clara reached up and took my hand. "Are you really my mama now?" she asked. "Forever and ever, until the stars fall from the sky?" "Forever and ever," I promised, "and nothing will ever change that." The years that followed were the happiest of my life. We kept the cottage at first, Thomas teaching piano to the children of local families, while I learned to be a mother to Clara. I had never imagined that I could love another person's child as my own, but Clara made it easy. She was bright and curious and endlessly affectionate, and she seemed determined to fill all the empty spaces in my heart with her love. We spent hours together in the garden, tending the flowers and feeding the rabbits that had become her special pets. We read books together by the fire, taking turns with the voices until we collapsed in laughter. We explored the moors and the forests and the hidden places of the countryside, discovering wonders that I had never known existed in the world. As word of Thomas's skill spread, students began arriving from farther and farther away. Parents brought their children from neighboring counties, seeking instruction from the professor who had once taught at London's finest academy. Thomas's reputation, damaged by grief and circumstance, was slowly being rebuilt through the quality of his teaching and the success of his students. Within 2 years, we needed larger premises, and we moved to a beautiful house in the village of Thornwood, a proper home with room for Thomas's teaching studio, and a garden for Clara, and space for the children that we hoped would come. And they did come. First, a boy we named James, with his father's gray-green eyes and my stubborn chin. He was born on a stormy night in November, and when I held him for the first time, I wept with a joy I had not known was possible. A year later came twin girls, Rose and Lily, who arrived screaming in a snowstorm and never stopped making their presence known. They were wild and mischievous, and absolutely exhausting, and I loved them more than I had ever loved anything. Clara adored her siblings with a fierce protectiveness that reminded me of her father. She helped me with the babies, changing their cloths and singing them to sleep and reading them stories from the picture books she had once loved. She was patient with James when he struggled with his letters, and she defended the twins against any criticism, even when they deserved it. Watching her grow from a frightened little girl into a confident young woman was one of the great privileges of my life. I never returned to Hartwell Manor. The great estate passed to a distant cousin who was welcome to its cold grandeur and its bitter memories. I had found a different kind of wealth, a treasure that no amount of gold could buy. I had found love and family and purpose, a life built not on duty, but on joy. My days were filled with music and laughter, with children's games and adult conversation, with the simple pleasures of a home where everyone was welcome and everyone was loved. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and Thomas sat playing softly at the piano, I would remember the woman I had been on that rainy day in Thornwood. The lonely Duchess, in her ruined silk slippers, walking through the mud toward a stranger's cottage, not knowing that she was walking toward her destiny. I would remember the moment I knelt beside Clara, the moment I looked into Thomas's eyes, the moment everything changed. And I would feel a gratitude so profound that it brought tears to my eyes. We do not choose the circumstances of our birth or the hands we are dealt in early life. I did not choose to be sold into a loveless marriage at 18, to spend 8 years as a ghost in my own home, to be mocked and belittled by a mother-in-law who saw me as nothing more than a failed vessel for her son's legacy. But we do choose what we do with the moments that matter, the crossroads where fate offers us a chance to become who we were meant to be. When I heard a child crying in a humble cottage, I could have walked past. I could have told myself it was none of my concern, that a duchess had no business involving herself in the troubles of the poor. Instead, I opened that door. I knelt in the dirt. I reached out my hand. And in doing so, I found everything I had ever wanted. Clara is grown now, a beautiful young woman who inherited her father's gift for music and her mother's gentle strength. She teaches at the academy Thomas eventually founded, training the next generation of musicians, and she is engaged to a young man who looks at her the way Thomas looks at me. James has gone to university to study law, determined to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. He wants to reform the orphanage system to ensure that no child ever suffers what Clara suffered at Blackmore. Rose and Lily are still at home, still arguing and laughing and filling our house with chaos and joy. They are 17 now, on the verge of womanhood, and I cannot quite believe that my wild little twins have grown so tall and so beautiful. And Thomas, my Thomas, still plays the piano every evening as the sun sets. His hair is silver now, and there are lines on his face that were not there when we met, but his eyes are unchanged. Still that stormy gray-green, still filled with love and music and life. He still looks at me as if I am the most beautiful woman in the world, and after 20 years of marriage, I have learned to believe him. I am writing this story because Clara asked me to, because she wants her own children to know how their family began. It is a story of sorrow and struggle, of cruelty and courage, of a love that defied every boundary that society tried to impose. But more than anything, it is a story of hope, of the belief that even in the darkest moments, when poverty crushes and grief blinds and powerful enemies seem unstoppable, there is always a chance for redemption. There is always a path to joy if only we are brave enough to take it. I was 26 years old when I first understood that wealth could not fill an empty heart. But I was also 26 when I learned that love could. That the truest riches are not found in gold or titles, but in the hand of a man who would give his last coin for his daughter's smile, in the arms of a child who calls you mama and means it, in the simple miracle of building a family from the ruins of lonely lives. They say a duchess should never lower herself to the ground. But I knelt in the dirt that day, and in doing so, I rose higher than I had ever been. This is my story. This is our story. And it ends not with tragedy or parting, but with music drifting through open windows, with children laughing in a sunlit garden, with Thomas's hand in mine as we walk together into a future we built ourselves. Love won. It always does in the end. And we lived, as the old stories say, happily ever after. There is a moment I return to often in my memories, a small thing that might seem insignificant to anyone else, but that has become precious to me beyond measure. It was a Sunday afternoon in our 3rd year at the house in Thornwood, and the autumn sun was streaming through the windows of the music room. Thomas was teaching James his first proper piece, a simple melody that the boy had been practicing for weeks. Clara sat beside me on the settee, her needlework forgotten in her lap, watching her father and brother with a soft smile on her face. The twins were playing quietly in the corner, for once not squabbling, building a tower of blocks that grew taller with each careful addition. I remember looking around that room and feeling a wave of contentment so profound that it nearly brought me to tears. This was everything I had ever wanted, everything I had been told was impossible for a woman like me. A home filled with love, a husband who cherished me, children who called me mother, and meant it with every fiber of their beings. I had been raised to believe that happiness was something that happened to other people, that my role was to be decorative and silent and grateful for whatever crumbs of affection were thrown my way. But here, in this modest house in a village no one had heard of, I had found a joy that the grandest ballrooms of London could never have provided. Thomas looked up from the piano and caught my eye, and he smiled at me with such warmth that my heart turned over in my chest. He knew what I was thinking. After all these years, he always knew. He reached out his hand to me, and I rose from the settee and went to stand beside him, my hand on his shoulder, as James continued to play his simple melody. "Listen," Thomas said softly. "Do you hear it? He is finding his voice." And I did hear it. In the imperfect notes of my son's first piece, I heard the beginning of something beautiful. I heard the music that would fill our house for years to come, the legacy that Thomas would pass to his children and they would pass to theirs. I heard the future unfolding before us, bright with promise and possibility. That is the moment I hold closest to my heart. Not the grand confrontation with Lady Beatrice, not the triumphant rescue of Clara, not even the day of my wedding, though all of those were precious. It is that quiet Sunday afternoon, surrounded by my family, bathed in autumn light, listening to my son discover music for the first time. That is when I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had made the right choice. That kneeling in the dirt of a stranger's cottage had led me to exactly where I was meant to be. The years have a way of softening the hard edges of memory, of making the painful times seem less painful and the joyful times more joyful. But I have tried to tell this story honestly, to remember not just the happiness, but the fear and the doubt and the desperation that came before. Because I think that is important. I think people need to know that joy is not given but earned, that love is not found but built, that the happy endings we read about in fairy tales come at a cost that the stories rarely mention. I paid that cost gladly. I would pay it again 1,000 times over. For Thomas, for Clara, for James and Rose and Lily and all the grandchildren who will come after. For the music that fills our home, and the laughter that fills our hearts, and the love that has made our humble house into a palace beyond price. If you are reading this, whoever you are, wherever you are, I hope that my story gives you courage. I hope it shows you that the circumstances of your birth do not determine the person you will become. I hope it reminds you that love is worth fighting for, that family is what we make it, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is kneel in the dirt beside a stranger and offer them our hand. The world will tell you that such things are impossible. The world will tell you to stay in your place, to accept your lot, to be grateful for whatever meager happiness you are allowed. Do not listen. The world is wrong. I was a duchess who knelt in the mud for a widower and his daughter. And in doing so, I found everything. This is my story. This is my truth, and I will carry it with me until the day I close my eyes for the last time, when I hope to find Margaret waiting for me on the other side, ready to thank me for loving her daughter and her husband as my own. Until then, I will sit in my garden and watch the sunset, Thomas beside me, our children and grandchildren gathered around us, and I will know that I am the richest woman who ever lived. Not because of gold or titles or the grand estates that once bore my name, but because I loved and was loved in return, and that, in the end, is all that truly matters.